There's a lot of expensive headphones in the world, especially in the high-end space, but none of them quite like the final D8000 Pro. Let's talk about it. This headphone is definitely something unique. It has some sonic traits I feel like that make it stand out from pretty much any other planar, and it kind of does the same visually as well, but it's not all perfect. Let's talk about the D8000 Pro, starting with build and comfort. Now, build-wise, the D8000 Pro, well, it's pretty solid, maybe unnecessarily solid in some ways, because it does have some extra weight in areas I think it doesn't need it. Now, this isn't to say that it's particularly uncomfortable, but as a result, I think it does need more padding up top. The bright side is the ear pads are plenty soft and plenty large. There's ample space on the inside of them, vertically, horizontally, and as far as depth is concerned. They're also pretty breathable. They don't get too hot on my head, and the friction system for adjusting them up and down rather than a clicky system, well, it's not bad. I did have concerns at first that these pieces would bang together and cause scratches, but it ends up they thought of that. There is a protective layer of clear plastic on the inside of the yoke right here. Is this a yoke? Could you call this a yoke? Let's just go with the adjustment mechanism, because that is a part of it. Not only does it slide up and down, but it also can tilt and swivel in a variety of directions. You want to lean a little bit forward or backwards? Sure, and this is actually welcome because the terminations on the bottom is a twist lock 3.5 that does protrude quite a bit, so you'll probably want to tilt these both forward a little bit. That way the cables can go out this way rather than straight down onto your shoulders. It almost doesn't look like an open back, but it is. This is an open back planar magnetic headphone, and if you look closely, this mesh on the side does have small holes in it. It's part of a very interesting damping system for the driver because it ends up these pads don't actually fully seal. Even though they feel like they do, they're breathable. And so Final had to use a somewhat unique damping system to get low frequency extension out of this driver. And they did a great job of that. So, I think with that said, let's move on to subjective sound, then we'll talk about objective sound and frequency response after that. Now, from a subjective point, this does have a few big strengths and a few weaknesses. Let's start off with the weak points first. It is a bit scooped out in the 2 kHz to 3 kHz range, almost like the ear gain has been taken and moved upwards in the frequency spectrum a bit. Vocal presence does suffer a bit as a result of this, but vocal clarity is still nice. You definitely won't get the intimacy with these though that you'll get with other headphones like the HD600 or some ZMFs. Instead, what you get is a very roomy and realistic, I would say, sound in terms of things that are recorded live. Specifically leaning into the strengths of this, live orchestral music. And what this does with live orchestral music is actually very interesting. See, this has, for orchestral music, a timbre that you don't find in planars. Most planars are metallic or plasticky or something or the other when it comes to orchestral music. They never sound quite right. Something will always be too dark or too bright, or you won't be able to capture like the deep, airy rumble of strings and brass and drums. But the D8000 Pro does it exactly like I'm there. We like to visit the BPO pretty often for live performances, and many headphones really do struggle to capture the timbre of every instrument in an orchestra. But the D8000 Pro makes that feel effortless. And I think part of what allows it to do so is not only the interesting tuning in the highs, but also the bass. This headphone, of course, it does have deep extending planar sub-bass, but it's very fast, very tactile, and most importantly, very dynamic. Something you hear a lot of people complain about with certain planars is the lack of dynamics, whereas these, I don't know if it's due to the different damping system, the different pads, or their own driver technology, but they are extremely dynamic, punchy, and lifelike in the bass. I mean, when you're talking like very large stringed instruments almost have a flutter to the string that reverberates around a room, you can hear it in these. And that bass is fast, it's snappy, and it's capable of producing those wild fluctuations in the low end. On the opposite of the spectrum, it's also fantastic for things like Lorne, which has quite literally reamped in large spaces low frequencies, so you can hear this massive space in the deep sub bass. I would go so far as to say this is probably the best bass that I've ever heard in a headphone. That is not a title I would give lightly. And it isn't to say the most bass either, because there's lots of headphones that have more bass than this, but it's not the same quality. It's not as satisfying as the bass on the D8000 Pro. The imaging is also pretty solid. It's better with live performances, and I think with especially binaural recordings it shines, but I wouldn't use the D8000 Pro for things like video games. Another strength of the D8K Pro is its detail, its resolving capability. It's great. I mean, it's more detailed than the vast majority of headphones I've heard at this price range. I would definitely put it over a lot of Hyphemans. But again, it might be a deal breaker for you if you don't like the tuning, which overall is mostly neutral until you get to that shifted ear gain in the treble. This doesn't make it bright. In fact, it makes it a bit more laid back, with the exception of like 14K-ish. You know, I don't know if I'm going to be able to describe this without going to objective sound, so let's talk about that with frequency response. So here I have a graph pulled up of the D8000 Pro. This is against our Harman combined target, and this is a raw measurement of the Gross 43AG. Now, if you haven't seen, we put out a video recently saying that we are going to be moving to both a new measurement system and a new target. That hasn't happened yet, but I highly recommend checking out that video so you're prepared when it happens. Until then, we're going to keep displaying measurements in the format that you're familiar with. As you can see, the bass is great on the D8000 Pro. It's not particularly elevated, though we do see just a bit of a bump in it. Sub-bass extension is really good, and mid-range is mostly linear, though we do see a bit of a recess around 500 Hz. Past there, ear gain starts to work out pretty naturally until about 1.6K, where we get a recess that ends around 4 kHz. Now that recess, you can see it's quite literally like the ear gain was shifted upwards in the frequency range. I think this frequency change is what makes it work so well for orchestral music, and also what gives it, well, kind of a disadvantage when it comes to vocal intimacy. I should note, with the one exception to that, if you like to listen to, say, binaurally recorded vocals, then it really shines, or something that has a bit of the space of the venue in it. Cecile McLaurin-Salvant's Dreams and Daggers is a great album that's an example of that, where vocals can still shine on the D8000 Pro. That is a very, very well recorded album. From 4 kHz up, we do see some bumps and dips. Nothing too drastic as far as peaks are concerned until we get into around the 14 kHz region. I don't think that it's as drastic as what's shown here, but in a listening sweep, it does sound like 14 kHz has some more energy to it. Luckily, it's not sibilant, and the treble doesn't get harsh or grating, but there is a bit more of it in the super high regions that are very airy. But outside of that, that dip between 1.5K to 4K, well, it doesn't really make this headphone sound harsh. It kind of brings things back and tames it a bit, because this is already a pretty detailed and aggressive planar. This kind of lays it back and makes it more manageable. It can still be very fast on attack and decay, but it doesn't feel like it's going to bite me. Now, whether or not that is to your preferences, well, that's up to you. I've just given you the data. You can do with it as you wish. So let's go to conclusions. The D8000 Pro is a pretty easy to drive, very unique planar. It's not perfect, as I said, it needs some more padding on top, but the pads on the side are great. I find the timbre of it fantastic, though vocal presence does suffer a little bit. It depends on the quality of the recording you're listening to and how it was recorded. If you really love detailed and tactile bass, this is pretty much end game for what you're looking for, unless you want bass that is heavily boosted. If you want to EQ the headphone, you absolutely can, and bringing up that area between like 1.6 to 4K, well, that can give you some pretty good and pretty linear results. Then you get the detail, the timbre, all that tactile bass, but with a more linear frequency response. It's all going to depend on your preferences, but I think that this is an extremely solid headphone. And several times throughout this review, I've been very tempted to add it to my collection. And you know, that day may come, but I have a few more things I need to try before I can pull the trigger on this one. Wrapping things up, the D8000 Pro tried something unique, and it actually turned out pretty great, something that doesn't often happen in the audio world. It's definitely a headphone worthy of being called a flagship, and I think for a lot of people this will be their absolute go-to. But that is going to wrap up today's video. If you liked it, please leave a like down below. Comment letting me know what you want to see in the future. If you want to get active in the community, you can at the forums or Discord, both at the link in the video description. As always, don't forget to stick around and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Until the next one, guys. Peace.